Hello and welcome to a pre-recorded session of the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media being held in San Jose on the 1st of August. My name is Katina and I'm the Executive Chair of the Symposium. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the main technical sponsor of our event, the IEEE Consumer Technology Society, for making this symposium possible. CTSOC realized that they required a transdisciplinary approach to address this global pressing issue related to the design and development of consumer technologies, and have called for diverse stakeholders to come together to respond to digital privacy requirements and matters pertaining to social media in particular. I would also like to thank for their patronage our gold patron, the IEEE Digital Privacy Initiative, that's doing wonderful work with IEEE Future Directions, and our silver patron, the Prototype Company, led by Darren Calbreth. And of course, for their ongoing support, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology, the Technical Committee on Socio-Technical Systems, led by Dr. Robert Abbas, and the IEEE Santa Clara Valley Section, and the CTSOC San Francisco Bay Area Chapter. Today, we have with us Kaylea Champion. And Kaylea Champion is a PhD candidate in communication at the University of Washington. She studies how people cooperate online, including who participates and who gets excluded. Prior to graduate school, she was an IT director and consultant, and I look forward to hearing about that lived experience. But today, Kaylea will present a full-length seminar titled, "What's Anonymity Worth?" We welcome you, Kaylea.
Thank you so much. Hello, IEEE Digital Privacy and Social Media. I'm Kaylea Champion from University of Washington, speaking to you from unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you the results of about 5 years of research, maybe 10 different research projects, 11 different folks now across 6 different universities. See all the names and things on the slides here, as part of kind of an overall project to try to understand what's anonymity worth. And with all this research being compiled into one place, I hope you'll pardon me. There's a lot of citations on the slides, but the good news is all of this is kind of pre-cooked into a kind of executive summary. It's a 2-pager. There's links at the end of the in that summary, and you can reach that from the end of the talk. All right, so a lot of different thoughts might come to mind when we talk about anonymity. And sometimes the words anonymity and privacy get used sort of interchangeably, but when we're thinking about them formally, they're not the same. I'm defining anonymity as a type of privacy, as a substate of privacy, but there are multiple kinds of privacy. And I'm working from some definitions developed by Weston in the 1960s. One type of privacy we might think about is the privacy of solitude. When you're by yourself, there's no one to be anonymous to. It's just you. There's privacy that comes from reserve, from having a private life versus a public life, or just not being open about certain details or facts. And there's a privacy in intimacy or within a given community. And our focus, there's anonymity, another substate of privacy. And this is the degree to which identifiable details are known or can be known by those receiving communication from us. So from this definition, we can see that anonymity is relational, that it's communicational. And who are these folks seeking anonymity online? Why do they want to be anonymous? In some cases, there's absolutely an element of criminality, maybe violating international laws or local laws without being caught, or maybe they just want to violate your terms of service. Some anonymity seekers are folks who have a strong principled preference to remain anonymous in some setting as a right, as a public good, or a sense that the powerful are not entitled to our information just because they want it. Some folks, though, have a deep necessity to keep their identity private for safety because of stigma or harassment or oppression. Engaging fully in the online world can put some people's lives at risk. And when we interviewed people seeking anonymity in online communities, they shared with us a very wide range of risks that they negotiate, including harassment, violence, reputation loss, Individuals may be targeted by abusers, stalkers, oppressive governments, hate groups, identity thieves, based on their online activities. So for some people, being able to conceal identifying information is what allows them to live their everyday life using online services in the same way as the rest of us. You or I might be able to say, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and write that publicly on Wikipedia without fearing for our safety. But in Belarus, Wikipedians have been put in prison for this. And this is just one in a long list of examples of how ordinary actions that are safe for some of us are extremely dangerous for others. In our study, we were very fortunate to be able to hear these stories about the necessity of anonymity because we could promise our interview participants we would maintain that anonymity. But those folks are unlikely to also be decision makers in product teams. And many sites make it quite difficult to conceal identifying information and maintain anonymity. Real name, birth date, postal code policies, account requirements. So we did a project inquiring into how platforms think about anonymity seekers. What kinds of concerns did platforms describe? Putting aside lost revenue from things like targeting ads and reselling information to data brokers, one answer is that service providers, like anonymity seekers, worry about harassment. Platforms also want to hold people personally accountable for bad behavior. Another answer, there are unknown unknowns. Perhaps we can see the damage being caused by people who aren't being held accountable, but the value they bring and the impact if we block them can be harder to see. Another answer, it can be difficult for people who can be identified without fear to speak on behalf of those who lack that privilege. Taking up the perspective of anonymity seekers can be a substantial challenge. So platforms see a trade-off between safety and risk, or maybe it should be said, a trade-off that equates closure with safety and openness with risk. Platforms see problems coming in from perhaps suspect anonymity seekers, and they have a community and an environment they want to protect. So we wanted to understand these trade-offs a little bit more. And this example is drawn from fandom.com, a little bit fun. Home to more than 250,000 sites, wide range of themes. There's probably a site about every TV show, game, movie, fandom you can imagine, music, books, hobbies, all kinds of things like that. There's a cocktails one. There's not a academia fandom site, but there is one about the anime My Hero Academia. So we used a natural experiment that occurred when some sites in fandom.com were shifted to requiring accounts and found that this decision carried some hidden costs, not only in terms of newcomers, but also decreasing activity from existing account holders. So to look at this, you can imagine the fandom sort of situation. They're inundated with vandalism and spam and other kinds of kind of bad behavior, things that were unwanted. They did what a lot of platforms would do. They instituted requirements around accounts, and that let us examine the causal effect of requiring accounts. So this is a figure from a paper. It's an interrupted time series. Let me kind of walk you through it here. On the left, we have the trend before the change, and on the right, in this kind of orange color, is the trend after the change. And at this 0 point, it's kind of marked with dotted lines. You see the sort of change point when that account requirement was put in place. So we test different impacts starting top to bottom here. At the top, this is the number of people making accounts. That's what they wanted. It jumps. That's exactly what we'd expect, and it's what was desired. Here we have the rate of kind of bad behavior, things that had to be then you go back and remove it, it drops off. Again, that's what was wanted. But the bottom two are unintended consequences. So this one shows the level of good contributions coming in, desirable behavior coming in, it drops off as well. And we see also that of the work that does continue to be done on fandom, the quality of that work is also sort of worse after the change. So that's what this one's measuring here. So what does this tell us kind of overall? What I'm calling closure or instituting this account requirement is a maneuver that's supposed to keep communities safe. But what we see from this example is that it also might harm the community by discouraging participation in ways that are hard to see unless we look outside of those intended consequences. All right, so my next set of examples are drawn from Wikipedia, which is extraordinarily important in its own right. Lots of statistics. This is just from June alone, top 10 site on the internet, available in over 300 languages, billions of monthly page views. But besides being a tremendously important information resource, it also has a community behind the scenes, large group of volunteers, these kind of very active editors, as well as a policy that allows new people to join. And that means they also allow, and Wikipedia, contributions from people without accounts. And for us, this is extremely important because it lets us make comparisons between the behaviors of groups of people with different levels of identifiability in a community setting where the work being done has this global impact. All right, so to dig into the value of anonymity seekers, we ran a comparison of work done on Wikipedia by account holders, they're here in purple, by newcomers, they're here on the left in red, contributors without accounts, or what we would call an IP-based editor, because you can see their IP address here in blue, as well as contributors coming in from Tor in green. And as digital privacy fans know, the Tor network and browser are a way to intentionally conceal that IP address and therefore your location. We use Tor as an example here because these are folks who are deliberately anonymity seeking. We know for sure that they are trying to maintain anonymity because it takes some extra effort to use the Tor network versus just sort of not bothering to log in or other kinds of situations. But you might make a similar comparison in another platform, verified versus non-verified users, longtime members versus newcomers, and so on. Okay, so what did we find? Graph of quality over time. What we see overall is that anonymity seekers from Tor are at about the same or slightly better quality than newcomers and about the same as non-account holders. And although earlier we talked a little bit about maybe anonymity seeking is for criminality, instead we see very strong similarity to these other groups, suggesting some of the value coming in from those other explanations: anonymity for safety purposes, anonymity by preference. Overall, these folks look a lot like everybody else, living out their lives in ways maybe we take for granted. But what about kind of unique or particular value? What makes anonymity seekers maybe different? We did observe that these Tor-based editors, our anonymity seekers, were more likely to contribute to political, religious, technical subjects, less likely to contribute to articles on, say, American football. So this is a population with maybe different interests and skills. And to investigate this potential, maybe unique value further, we constructed the stories of some of these contributions from Tor using a forensic approach. We found a lot of very typical behavior, as you might not be surprised to hear: factual additions, typo fixes, and vandalism. All of this is typical kind of everyday stuff within Wikipedia. We also saw some work that connects to a need for anonymity. So writing about human rights abuses, removing the work of conspiracy theorists. That's work that could get some pushback, could draw some harassment, and does. But what about the bad stuff? What about the vandalism? We did an analysis of vandalism, same 4 groups. We found that Tor users, that most anonymous group, were actually less likely to vandalize than other kinds of folks without accounts. They're more comparable to those newcomers. But one distinction we did find is that vandalism from Tor was less kind of jokey, less sociable. Tor users were more likely to directly critique and challenge the Wikipedia community, which at that time was trying to ban them from the site. So I've tried to make the case here that there's some good that might be lost if we exclude people based on their anonymity. But platforms and communities see this trade-off: closure and safety, openness and risk. What can these stories about contribution types tell us about this trade-off? And I want to invite folks to look at a different type of trade-off here, to think in 2 dimensions. You could apply this to any community, thinking about the kinds of activity that goes on. Participation might be clustered into types, and those types might vary in value to the community. Here I've put it on this kind of y-axis, from kind of damaging kinds of behaviors to valuable behaviors. And then along the x-axis, we can think about the impact on the person doing the contribution, the person participating. For them, anonymity might be largely irrelevant, or it might be absolutely critical. So this doesn't include spillover or other kinds of unintended consequences like we saw in the fandom example. All right, so what can we do if we want to save space for valuable participation from anonymity seekers? There are multiple successful strategies available. Some communities have chosen to essentially take the good with the bad, bake that anonymity seeking behavior right into the operational model, embrace throwaway accounts, fully anonymized participation. And some applications are going back and kind of rethinking their requirements. I'm thinking particularly here about the case of personal fertility tracking applications. After some changes in the civil rights environment in the United States, some organizations are seeing personal health data as an area with potential for innovation around anonymity. And this is further evidence, I think, that anonymity specifically, not just privacy overall, offers a strategic differentiator, area of innovation. I probably don't need to mention in this community that there's a whole research subfield focused on privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs. One of these is cryptographic techniques to allow blocking of rule breakers without blocking anonymity preserving tools. Another set of strategies target directly the sort of cheap pseudonym problem, trying to make those pseudonyms less cheap. Another strategy is pre-publication moderation. Essentially, this is routing the activities of anonymity seekers for more scrutiny until they accumulate some degree of trust from the community. And this is the kind of freshest result from our team. Our observation here is these communities are able to make this pre-publication model work, and to do so without discouraging newcomers and account creation. So here's a figure extracted from that work, another one of these interrupted time series. The 0 point where the rules changed. On the left, we have the situation before these non-account holders were routed for extra scrutiny, extra moderation. And on the right, we have activity after the screen was put in place. Units are kind of standard deviation units, so they're a little bit compressed. And what we see overall is that although non-account holders dropped their participation, new contributors and returning contributors were able to persist and stay flat throughout. So the sort of unintended consequences and spillover that we saw in fandom did not occur in these communities that embraced a pre-publication kind of moderation approach in Wikipedia. All right, so what's coming next from us? We're digging in a little bit further about the value of anonymity, particularly in supporting work on taboo subjects. We're digging into pre-publication moderation with some follow-up, and we're doing a little bit of exploration, seeking out new settings for studying anonymity and new ways to measure value. I'm eager for your thoughts on this topic. Where does all this leave us? People have good reasons to be anonymous online, but platforms and communities may respond to them with suspicion and not take up their perspective. Anonymity seekers are often comparable to other groups like newcomers and casual contributors. They may offer unique value or tackle riskier types of work. When they act badly, it may be similar to bad behavior we see from others, although banning them for being an anonymity seeker may make them angry or trigger a desire to subvert that block. And there are options for mitigating the negative effects of anonymity seekers without banning them altogether. So how do I think we as an IEEE community go forward from here? I hope we'll continue to challenge assumptions about anonymity. And together with our friends in the product development community, I see so many opportunities to innovate around anonymity, to shift the conversation out of just living in trust and safety departments, security departments, into product teams. And finally, I think we need to build more partnerships between platforms and research teams. Our work so far has made a lot of use of data from fandom and Wikipedia. They have made data available to us, built partnerships with us. We can bring even more insights to light with more of these partnerships. So if you know about a platform that's contemplating a change to identity policies, let's talk. Anonymity is desirable for many, essential for some. We are creating rich technologies to engage online. Let's work together to make sure everyone can join us. I am so eager for feedback and questions. Thank you for your attention. There's an executive summary of this work linked from my website there at the bottom. And thank you to the NSF for their support.
What an impressive presentation, Kaylea Champion. Some pertinent topics you've covered there, especially with respect to the theme of our conference, the digital privacy and social media. It smack bang hits on the conference theme. The first question I wanted to ask you is it possible today to completely be anonymous in all our dealings with the online world? Is it possible, and I hate to use this term, but to live off the grid while still having access to the grid?
That's an interesting question. I think that from a purely technical perspective, being able to, that there's enough sort of technology and techniques that people can at least discern some information about behavior based on patterns, stylometrics, in a like strictly technical sense. I think that we live on a connected planet, one earth shared among all of us, and those things are visible if we dig long enough and hard enough. I think in a more sort of practical sense, being able to figure things out about each other, I think that we can maintain levels of privacy and levels of anonymity when we choose to, and sort of pick and choose as we work our way through and kind of navigate the world. I think that those options are still out there. But there's trade-offs with those for us personally. The less people know about us, the less they can support us on a personal level. And the less people know about us, the less likely they are to believe certain things we say. So I think that there's certainly trade-offs, but there's also possibilities.
Nigel Fair, and we were talking about trust, and he said one way to increase trust is actually to put your name out there and to keep putting it out there. And he wrote an article for one of our national security workshops which demonstrated exactly what he was saying. But very much when we start to look at one of the areas you spoke about, which was safety and perhaps gender violence as an extension, we have one of our speakers, Toby Shurif, from Arizona State University, talking about this. She's a veteran at the National Domestic Violence Network and has been looking into these areas with regards to technology and the complexity there if someone does want to become anonymous after having shared their profile online. Just very basic, even when we see applications trying to use a inverted commas real ID becomes complex. And what's it like today? Our right to be known by different IDs or by different names. You know, if I want to be called Jack somewhere and Katina somewhere else, how difficult is that, especially with ID bridging, when we're seeing this across network, across platform, this persistent ID? Do we have a right to be known by anything we want to be known by in terms of name or identity?
I think that people have a right to control the kinds of information about themselves that's distributed out there. Do I have a right to assert my identity that in a way that's contrary to any of my identification? It depends entirely on sort of what that information is used for. I think that one persistent identity across all platforms, this kind of fully collapsed context, is not consistent with human thriving. I am not the same person at this conference that I am at the PTA meeting, and I am not the same person at the PTA meeting that I am at a protest. I'm not the same person when I'm with my mother as I am when I'm only with my friends. And being able to maintain some of those boundaries that we do so naturally in our kind of face-to-face kind of environments online is tremendously challenging, but I think it's a fight worth having.
I think so too. And there we go into this notion of life worlds, and that we all have multiple life worlds in different contexts. Kaylea, I remember a paper by Professor Marcus Wigan, formerly of the University of Melbourne, who talked about our right to be known by different names. He presented that at the second workshop on national security and the social implications there. And increasingly what we're seeing is this contextual input from users across platforms. And having this right to privacy becomes an important concept, as you mentioned, Alan Weston's work back in the 60s. I consider surveillance in the context of the public space, and I think your work in particular becomes important here when we look at this cyber-physical existence. I'll give you one example. I kept thinking of Street View, Google Street View here, and I am going to identify it, although there are many different applications that do the same thing and different platforms that do the same thing. So I remember the early debate as a member of the Australian Privacy Foundation since 2008, where we were looking at exceptions and how platform providers deal with exceptions. And so, for example, in a public space, Street View can go and take images of homes as they're combing the streets of a suburb to give us that amazing capability of navigation and also directions when we are using Google Maps, for instance. So if I call up as a citizen and say, excuse me, I'm exercising my right to privacy, my home, despite that you've not trespassed, is my castle. And I would rather you have it off the map than on the map. I don't want you to see the color of my car, the color of my clothes hanging on the clothesline, even if there are images that have been blurred out of different artifacts or living subjects. And that exception is almost like there's a crater in that cadastral block around the neighborhood. And so then we have, this indirect implication that these plots have inhabitants or dwellers that are potentially privacy sensitive, although it could be a number of different reasons. People don't want a dilapidated block on, a home to be viewed when their address is being searched, perhaps in a private context of an organization. So what happens when these kinds of things become exceptions and you stand out as an outlier instead of, so I seek anonymity, but the result of me seeking anonymity means that I've lost my anonymity, even if I am not identified. What can you tell us about the minefield in this context, in this scenario?
Yeah, that is a difficult case because it's a little bit Kantian. You think about the kind of categorical imperative here, like if we all then decided to opt out of Google Street View, well, the thing wouldn't be very useful for the whole rest of the world. And I've kept myself from getting lost and maybe wandering someplace I shouldn't be wandering by using this, having this great view of the world and having this great view of the map. On the other hand, people have very direct needs for privacy and safety. And you can imagine too, maybe there's a sort of mixed result we can put in here where some people opt in and for reasons of preference and some people opt in for reasons of safety. And as allies, we kind of keep one another safe that way. But there again, you can sort of threaten the integrity of the resource for everyone. I would put that challenge as an engineering challenge. The engineering of the service and the system needs to be ethical, and that includes thinking about how can we make this work for everyone, including the vulnerable, including people who have these kind of privacy preferences. So I'm not in charge of solving the engineering challenge, but I would say, does it actually have to be that photorealistic? Does it have to actually look like my kid who ran outside without a shirt as I ran after them and pulled the shirt over their head? Like, does that have to be immortalized forever? Maybe not. That moment doesn't need to be permanent on the record of what my neighborhood looks like. But maybe there's another way to make things just as realistic, just as useful to the public without violating kind of individual rights. And that's a balance I think that technology can solve. We can do that.
I love that response. And I do remember reviewing some of the bungles, I'm going to call them, with respect to photography taken by Google Street View cars, and, unbelievable things like people drunk on their lawns, even though their face was blurred out, people having a domestic outside on the street, one person lying down going, X, Y, Z, and some other very compromising things like people taking a pee on a highway, and being sort of exposed in many different ways, and to the point they're exposed in a real way. But I do like your approach that this is an engineering problem. In fact, that's the main emphasis of the conference theme. And when you talked about product teams and the product challenge during your talk, I have an affinity with that, being from industry originally as well. I think it is that. I think we have to become even more innovative, even more creative with our solutions. There are answers to these things, perhaps not categorically black and white answers, but answers that may help us address the issue and problem at hand, so that we don't get, for example, discouraged participation when ID is required or becomes persistent in some platforms. I mean, you mentioned the wonderful research output from your work on fandom.com and Wikipedia. I think you've just put a grand challenge to our major big tech corporations who will be gracing us in person on the day of the conference. But let's start to unpack a little bit anonymity on Wikipedia, for example. It's wonderful that you've spent time researching this with your team. And to look at this idea of vandalism, for many, and it doesn't have to be conspiracy theorists who are putting this forward, who are these editors? And the vandalism potentially has been very real for some communities, in particular academic members with published peer review research. Who gets to have an identity even becomes controversial based on, relying on other people. I, for one, steer clear away from having any entry on Wikipedia, given a past experience I witnessed, where you almost had a response of an attack. And this happens with those subjects that are taboo subjects in particular that you mentioned in your research that you're exploring in a peer-reviewed paper. But who are these editors, these administrators? The editors are one thing. I think you showed us a figure of 37,000, but the administrative cluster, and I remember hearing a talk at an ISIS conference in Italy in 2008, where the presenter, from having spent a visiting time at LSE, London School of Economics, was talking about, well, we're at that heyday in 2008 where we're growing the data behind Wikipedia. And so definitions become important, and it's sort of easy to do the definitions. And then those little tweaky updates become very complex. And of course, who are these people that are making these big time-intensive tweaks to pages based on background history? And for anyone who studied history, authorship is so important. Knowing who the author was is one of the biggest things, date, authorship, genre kinds of inquiries, especially to textual criticism, dating back thousands of years. And if we look at 2,000 years' time, we will reflect on who were these editors in Wikipedia, who had the time to actually explore. And it's interesting that you note about what kind of identity is almost akin to the authorship question, but it isn't the same thing. Did you find anything in particular, and did you make any assessment?
So it's true that the Wikipedia community is large and diverse, and there's actually 300 different Wikipedia communities because there's 300 language editions. And some people, of course, are members of both. English is certainly the largest. It's a grand experiment in how do we work together across all of these lines? How do we work together to decide what's true? Can we build enough of an immune system to keep the bad actors out? And can we do that collectively and collaboratively? Part of how Wikipedia does this is with artificial intelligence. Part of how they do it is with well-intentioned, hardworking volunteers, people who sort of just do their best every day. There's a lot of heroism, I would say, in the writing of Wikipedia. And there's also, like anywhere, trolls and vandals and litterbugs and people who you wish would just be quiet sometimes. So it's a diverse community, and it's certainly not perfect, but I will say it's pretty amazing to see what they've been able to produce in terms of this sort of available sort of free knowledge. Surveys of who writes Wikipedia do tend to come back with results that will not surprise anyone who studies gender gap or racial gaps or ethnic gaps in online environments. often tend to be college-educated white males in the United States, at least. But I would say that there's a lot of work going on in the community to make that environment more diverse and to bring in more voices from the global South and to make sure that all of these language communities are fully sort of supported. It's a work in progress and one that anybody is welcome to join, which is pretty amazing and pretty impressive. I would say in terms of your sort of question about what about the sort of negative behaviors that come in, I think that here also, this is a resource that's only as good as the people who join it. And so far it's been very successful. There's a reason that if you ask your smart device to answer a question, it probably gives you an answer from Wikipedia. But the question of what's true and what's correct is just driven entirely by those citations and the accuracy of those citations and the efforts that we all put in to our scientific papers to stand behind those with our name. Wikipedia is a tertiary or a third level resource, so its accuracy relies on the papers that it cites and the books that it cites. So click into those little tiny boxes and see what you think of the sources that the Wikipedia article is written from. And I'd say if it's wrong, you can fix it too.
Yes, and often it's not so much that it's wrong, I think, Kaylee, but sometimes it's what has been omitted that can be the issue. But of course, that requires participation. And with full agreement, I see the perspective you've provided very balanced and sober. If we shift now to a paper you have in progress or a project you have in progress where you look at, if I'm not mistaken, did you mention peer review and the anonymity in the peer review process? Is that correct?
No, this is a paper that I have under review. It's a paper currently undergoing peer review. So the full results are not released yet. That's what I meant by that.
Yes.
That's my current sort of work, and that's under review. And it's about taboo subjects and how much does anonymity and privacy help us deal with taboo subjects. The top line result there is that within Wikipedia, given kind of a menu of ways that people can be anonymous, successfully contributing to those taboo subjects about sexuality, about kind of gender related issues, some of the most taboo things. We probably can't say it in this recording, the things that these articles are about. So we find that people don't just sort of uniformly choose privacy or uniformly choose anonymity, but rather sort of pick and choose among these options to build their own kind of profile or build their own approach that meets their needs rather than seeking anonymity in kind of a uniform way. And there's a complex kind of trade-off, I think, going on in their privacy behaviors, where they're sort of balancing what they need to do to be credible to other people in the community, to put in their contributions successfully in ways that people will believe and allow to persist, versus what will sort of get removed or not relied upon and removed from those articles. I think all have a place.
Yes, your research is so pertinent. I'll give you an example. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation here in Australia just went live with the requirement to have an identity to access content from the ABC on its iView platform. And there's been a massive backlash by the Australian population saying, you know, all I'm trying to do is access taxpayer funded content on the ABC. And now you're telling me that I need to enroll. And I think that would be another good example, like the fandom example, where you measure what happened before and what happened after. And it has actually discouraged participation. It has got people thinking, well, am I being surveilled for the content I'm looking at, particularly of these sensitive topics that you're starting to research in depth. I also think this notion of the price of security, and as a couple of University of South Australia and University of Tasmania academics focused on, was the price of privacy. And I know that sometimes that's synonymous with price as in a monetary figure, as in the context of the price of security in organization. And there are all these financial calculations that you can do. But what do you think about this notion of a price of privacy? Does it make sense to you?
I think that it does. There's certainly a price of security and a price of privacy. And the question I think we need to always think about is, how do we have a value, not just a price? How do we have a value on each of these, and make those trade-offs with our eyes kind of fully open? If we are anonymous, just as we talked about with the Street View kind of example, removing that information from the public sphere, from the public way, has a cost to the public. It might have a cost to us. Maybe people can't find our house now. They can't, or no one wants to rent our Airbnb because it looks a little sketchy. These things can have a personal cost, and withholding our information, I think, can absolutely have a cost to the systems in which we participate, as well as to ourselves and to our friends. Recommendation systems are built on the idea that I like something similar to what other people who like the thing that I like. And so we love the great feeds that these apps are enabled to give us through these recommender systems. But if I withhold my data, my recommendations get worse instead of yours.
Yes. To my second last question, going back to the beginning of living off the grid, do you think it almost becomes impossible in this hyper-connected world we live in, if you don't have an email address and you don't have a mobile phone, to actually be considered a person? Can you tell me about the reliance on an email address and a mobile phone?
That's interesting. Yeah, this is something that I'm thinking about a lot, because in the pandemic, our ability to do contact tracing is totally dependent on us having carried a mobile phone with us in our pockets the whole time we were out in the world exposing one another to our viruses. That's what the whole thing is built on. And so the question of whether or not you can fully participate in society without these items, we're increasingly building innovations that make that very difficult, if not impossible. On the other hand, people do it every day. The global South is filled with people who live their lives day in, day out, do not need or want an email address. And I think that we want to be sort of careful about thinking about what it means to participate in society when we have these vast digital divides as well.
Definitely a pertinent point there, Kaylee. And I think about other more hyper-connected societies like Asia, where the saturation of mobile phones is greater than one. So more than, people own multiple phones, not just one number, sometimes for work and sometimes for personal context. I think your research is so important to most of our stakeholders, if not all, at this conference. But the question I've asked of every one of our presenters so far is, if you had one message for Silicon Valley, what would it be?
That's a great question. I love that. I think my one, I guess, message or lesson would be, let's work together to look for unintended consequences and opportunities to innovate further.
That's wonderful. This notion of cooperation that is in your abstract and inclusion of diverse stakeholder sets is so important. And we've been talking throughout the presentations, the pre-records, on what would that look like? How would it happen? How could we visualize this kind of community building? But Athena Actipis at Arizona State University deals with this notion of cooperation, and she's finding very interesting work in her evolutionary psychology work, which is pointing back to how do people cooperate and what's the effect of cooperation. And I love that spirit of your research. I love that you're so sober and balanced in your assessment, and that you have published research and you have actually looked at real data, real evidence to point to your findings. That's paramount for our community at large. But I thank you so much, Kaylea Champion, for your time. We wish you all the best as you, at the end, I see potentially of your work as a PhD candidate, and I look forward to seeing you as a future academic or going back into industry and sharing those findings from your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Well, if you've enjoyed this pre-record for the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media, please consider registering as an in-person delegate or online delegate. You can register at this address. Again, if you are appreciating the content so far, consider looking into these societies that are supporting and sponsoring the conference: the IEEE Consumer Technology Society, the IEEE Digital Privacy Initiative, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology, and of course, IEEE Future Directions Committee. I'd like to thank you for listening, but also our guest presenter today, Kaylea Champion of the University of Washington. Thank you again, Kaylea.
Thank you.